So here's an interesting question. Why do people who are King James only dislike the New King James Version? You would think if they are proponents of the King James Version as opposed to modern translations, then they would like the New King James because it is essentially the King James Version but updated. I come from a King James only background, just so everybody understands, and I do want to say in doing a video like this that I have no interest in bashing the King James or telling people not to use the King James. I think that the King James is a great translation, and I'm certainly happy that people want to read the Bible, and if they want to read it in the King James Version, that is fine with me. That being said, I do have a problem with misinformation and with people who are binding other people's consciences in a way that is not biblical. And if someone is using a translation that is not the King James, I think it can be a real problem when King James only people become very critical and actually I think in some ways hurt the faith of people who are using translations other than the King James Version. Well, I saw back in college even, again, coming from a King James only background, I remember someone at college was doing a presentation that was pro KJV only, and he talked about how all the other modern translations don't have the full verses of 1 John 5, 7, and 8. However, I actually showed him this, that if you compare 1 John 5, 7, and 8 in the King James on the left here to the New King James on the right, you'll see that both verses are there in their entirety. So the problem that people in the King James only camp have with the New King James isn't really that it's so different from the King James. But what you do see here in the New King James is there is a footnote on this verse that says, NU and M omit the words from in heaven in verse 7 through on earth in verse 8. Only 4 or 5 very late manuscripts contain these words in Greek. So I had a theory recently that one of the main reasons that King James onlyists don't like the New King James Version isn't actually the text itself, although they will criticize the New King James biblical text in certain ways, because in reality, the main thing they don't like is anything that is not the King James Version. So we do need to understand that. But with the New King James, one of the main problems I surmise that they had was actually the footnotes, not the text itself. And sure enough, I happened to see this video today that really confirmed that theory.
Sometimes people give you a message without saying it directly. Do you know what the message of the New King James footnotes really is? Hi, I'm David Daniels from Chick Publications. When I was in Bible college, I got my first New King James New Testament. This came out in 1979, and it looked like this. Let me show you something. Can you see? See here? There's no footnotes. What this told me was, we have confidence in this text. Now, in 1982, the New King James Bible came out, and of course it had footnotes. In fact, it had footnotes marked either M or NU. What that meant is this. The M meant the majority text, supposedly, and the M meant, no. You text up there, you're all wrong. What you really should say is this. And the NU text said, oh no, the scholarly Nestle's UBS critical text, which means Alexandrian, really says this. Footnotes never lead you to faith. Footnotes only lead you to doubt. Okay, wise guy, what about the footnotes in the King James Bible? I'll tell you once, and you'll remember forever. The King James Bible was the first time 54 plus translators who actually wanted to translate the Word of God got together into one place to do the job. Well, 3 places, but you know what I mean. After they had gone through the text 14 plus times, they had to have some rules about what to do. What if one guy still had an objection after 14 times through every single verse of the Bible? Well, they said, we will put it in a footnote or an endnote or a side note or a whatever note, preceded by the word or. So if it says or, you can ignore.
So that was just some portions of a clip from someone who I think is KJV only there. And you can see the problem that he is stating is the New King James footnotes. He says that footnotes have a hidden message and that footnotes will never lead to faith. They'll only lead you into doubt. So as I conjectured, I thought that one of the big problems for the New King James, for King James onlyists, are the New King James footnotes. And really, I think the problem for the King James only movement is that they don't like the fact that footnotes expose an underlying reality. And if you don't have footnotes, you don't have to think about those things. But if you have footnotes, then it kind of forces you to confront some of these realities. And one reality is, what is the content of the original biblical text? And the other reality is, what is the meaning of the original biblical text in our language? Now, he actually, in that video, interestingly says that the King James Version itself also has footnotes, or originally had footnotes. And it's ironic to me that with the King James Version, he says, if there's a footnote that says or, if there's an or, you can just ignore the or, something like that. And I think it's pretty funny because he's saying basically that in the King James Version, you can ignore the footnotes. Problem solved. But for some reason in the New King James Version, you can't ignore the footnotes. So it kind of shows you there is a double standard there, and that often happens in this whole issue of King James onlyism, a double standard. But for those who don't have an a priori argument trying to support a certain Bible translation, there are some underlying things that footnotes tell us. And I think the New King James, the advantage of it is actually that it's very transparent. And I think transparency is actually a very good thing and can actually help your faith if you approach it from a certain vantage point. But as I said, one of the underlying realities is the question of what is the content of the biblical text. And in the New King James Version, it does talk about different manuscripts. But even the King James Version, those translators had to decide what they were going to put into the biblical text. They had to have a textual basis. They were using what today is called the Textus Receptus. But as I've talked about before, you could even say that the Textus Receptus, which was put together by a man, a scholar named Erasmus, and he had to take different Greek texts and compare them and put them together and decide what did the original manuscript actually say. What did the original writers of the Bible actually write? So in that sense, it is a critical text. And the King James translators were basing their work off of Erasmus's Textus Receptus. But they still had to deal with these realities as to what was in the original text, just like we do today. And I wanted to show some examples actually in the King James Version of where you see hints of this. And one is in 1 John chapter 2, verse 23. And if you look closely here, you're going to notice something very interesting. It says, Whosoever denieth the Son, the same hath not the Father. And then notice the second part of this verse. What do you notice about it here? It's all in italics. Now we know that italics normally signify supplied words in English, words that do not directly come to us from the original Hebrew or Greek. But here you have a whole part of a verse that is in italics. So I don't think the King James translators were making these words up or trying to insert something into the Bible. This, I believe, just reflects a reality that they had to make a judgment call as to what the original verse actually said. And so they do have this second section here in italics. It might be equivalent to what the New American Standard Bible does sometimes with brackets, putting certain parts of a verse in brackets, if there's some question as to what the original verse actually contained. So that's one example where you kind of see what I'm talking about come out. What did the original text actually contain? What was the content of the original text? Another example is in John chapter 8. Again, this is the King James Version we're looking at here. And it says in the second part of verse 6, "But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground." And notice again, it has this whole phrase here, all in italics, as though he heard them not. So in looking at those portions of the King James Version, I'm not trying to criticize the King James Version in any way. I'm just trying to demonstrate that they had to deal with the same realities that we deal with today in Bible translations, that sometimes there is some question as to what the original text contained. And my contention is that if your faith is destroyed by something like a footnote, then how firm of a faith do you really have? Because these are realities that you can actually demonstrate even from the King James itself. It may not be in a footnote, but you can see it in the italics in these verses here, that there might be some question as to what the original text actually said. And I don't think that in any way completely undermines our faith. I think that just shows transparency. And by the way, one of the transparent things that the King James translators did is they did make use of italics for supplied words in English, or in these cases, I'm assuming that what we're seeing here is some question as to the original wording of the text. And the reason that that doesn't undermine my faith is because if you compare it to other ancient writings, what you'll see is there's actually a lack of information and a lack of abundance of manuscript evidence for other ancient writings. So what we have in the English language for the Bible is a wealth of information to look at. And I understand that's overwhelming for some people. I'm not saying you have to look at all the footnotes. If you want to ignore the footnotes, I think you can ignore the footnotes in any translation. I'm just saying I don't think your faith should be totally undermined and shattered because you see some footnotes. And one other thing I'll say is he does actually bring up the fact that the King James translators also use footnotes for alternate translations. Maybe a word or a phrase could be translated in a different way, and they put the word "or" in a different translation in the footnote. So that shows you the other reality that I was talking about, not just the content of the original language, but the meaning of the original language, and that sometimes you do have different ideas as to how to correctly translate certain words. And let me say one more thing on that note. I actually think that if you too rigidly try to keep the same words for centuries, that what happens, and I think Mark Ward has demonstrated this very powerfully, is that sometimes by keeping the words the same, you actually change the meaning, which is very counterintuitive, but it's a reality. That there are certain words that when you read them in the King James Version, they mean something very different today than they did 400 years ago. Now, some people will argue, well, all you have to do is read a dictionary. If there's a word you don't understand in the King James, read it in the dictionary. The problem, though, and this is what I mean about you actually need sometimes words to be changed in order to keep the meaning the same, or if you keep the words the same, the meaning changes. There are words that when you read them, you think you know exactly what they mean. We call them false friends. And this actually does happen when you're reading the King James Version. So you can't look the word up because you don't even know that you don't know the meaning, because you actually are reading the word thinking, I know exactly what that means. But you're misunderstanding what it meant to the people who translated the King James Version. So in reality, I don't think there should be so much hatred for the New King James Version. The footnotes are just transparent, and they shouldn't undermine our faith. They just point us to underlying realities of the different manuscripts and how we compare those manuscripts and come up with what we put into the biblical text. What we're ultimately trying to do, which is what Erasmus was trying to do back in the 1500s, is just make sure we are as accurate as possible in determining the content of the original writings. The New King James also, though, updates certain translation choices and meanings that are, I think, very accurate for our language today. And I think that's another reason why it's good to have an updated translation of the King James Version. So again, I'm not trying to discourage people from using the King James and telling people you can't use it. I'm just saying I think that the New King James isn't ultimately hated based on anything that has any solid ground. I think the New King James ultimately is disliked because it's not the King James Version, and because, as I said, it exposes some underlying realities that are true for the King James Version, just like it is true for modern versions. So I hope in what I have talked about and shown you here, you've seen the case that I'm making and why I'm saying these things. And I hope it's helped some people. If you have any questions or thoughts on this, of course, you can feel free to leave those in the comment section. I always tell people to try to keep those comments constructive, helpful. We want to be edifying to people's faith. But thank you so much for taking some time to listen to some of my thoughts on this subject, brought to you from a Frisch perspective.